The air at the Henderson Farm auction hung thick and heavy, smelling of diesel exhaust, rust, and the cheap coffee brewing in a percolator on the back of a pickup tailgate. It was late March, 1968. The ground was still too soft to work, a soggy brown blanket waiting for the sun, and so every farmer in Calhoun County with a spare dollar and a hole in his machinery lineup was here, kicking tires and telling lies. I was there for one thing, lot number 47, a 1959 John Deere 730 diesel. It wasn't pretty. The green paint was faded to the color of old moss, flaked away on the fenders to reveal patches of orange surface rust. The seat cushion was split, disgorging yellowed foam like a wound. But I'd walked around it 3 times, my eyes tracing the lines a mechanic sees. The sheet metal was straight, no welds on the frame. The rear tires were mismatched, one Firestone and one Armstrong, but they both had about 40% tread left. Enough to get by. Most importantly, the pony motor was all there. I could see the little Zenith carburetor, and the fuel lines looked sound. It hadn't been run in years, according to the auctioneer's boy, but the bones were good. I stood with my arms crossed, my shadow long in the morning sun, just watching the crowd. Then I heard that laugh, a loud, braying sound that always set my teeth on edge. Dale Bishop. He came strutting through the line of old iron like a rooster in a henhouse, a new DeKalb hat perched on his head, his boots looking like they'd never seen a real day's worth of mud. He was the first man in the county to buy a brand new 4020 with the side console, and he never let anyone forget it. He'd borrowed deep to get it, along with a 6-bottom plough and a new planter. His philosophy was simple: go big or go home. Mine was simpler. If you can't pay cash, you can't afford it. He saw me looking at the 730 and swaggered over, a smirk plastered on his face. "Thinking of getting into the museum business, Art?" he boomed, slapping the big flywheel with the palm of his hand. The sound was a dull thud. "This old popper couldn't pull your hat off your head." "It'll do the work I need it to do, Dale," I said, my voice low and even. I didn't give him the satisfaction of looking at him. I just kept my eyes on the tractor. "Work? You call what you do work? My 4020 can plough more in an afternoon than this thing could in a week. You're stuck in the past, man. The future is horsepower and leverage. You gotta spend money to make money." I finally turned to face him. He was a good 4 inches shorter than me, but he puffed his chest out to make up for it. "My father left me 300 acres, free and clear," I said quietly. "And a piece of advice. The bank is a tool, not a partner. I aim to keep it that way." Dale just laughed again, that irritating sound echoing off the side of Henderson's barn. "You and your daddy. Stubborn as 2 mules in a new harness. Have fun with your relic." He walked off toward the concession stand, clapping other farmers on the back, his voice carrying on the breeze as he talked about interest rates and expansion. When Lot 47 came up, the bidding started slow. $200, $250. I let the tire kickers and the scrap haulers play their little game. At $400, they dropped out. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Bill Peterson, pointed his cane at me. "400 I've got, do I hear 4 1/4? 4 1/4 anywhere." I gave a slight nod. 4 1/4 from Art Madsen. "Now who'll give me 450? A voice from the back of the crowd yelled, "450! It was Dale. He wasn't even looking at the tractor. He was looking right at me, that same smug grin on his face. He was just running up the price. I knew it. He knew it. The whole county knew it. 475, I said, my voice flat. 500! Dale shot back immediately. Bill Peterson's head swiveled between us like a man watching a tennis match. The other farmers went quiet, enjoying the show. This wasn't about a tractor anymore. It was about two different ways of looking at the world, playing out in $50 increments. My limit was $600. Not a penny more. I'd done the math in my head a dozen times. The tractor was worth $450 as it sat. I figured another $150 in parts, and my own labor would get it field ready. $5.25, I called out. $5.50. Dale's voice was getting louder, more arrogant. I took a deep breath. I could feel the blood pounding in my temples. It was foolish pride, and I knew it, but I also knew that tractor was sound. $600, I said, looking straight at Dale, not the auctioneer. A hush fell. Dale's grin faltered for just a second. He hadn't expected me to go that high. He'd wanted to make me overpay, to make me look like a fool who let his pride get the best of him. But $600 was just a little too rich for a joke. He shook his head with a dismissive wave. Sold. Bill Peterson's gavel cracked down. For $600 to Arthur Madsen. I walked over to the clerk's table, ignoring the whispers and the stares. I pulled my old leather wallet from the back pocket of my overalls, the same one my father carried for 30 years. I counted out 30 $20 bills, the paper worn and soft. No loans, no credit, no payments, just cash on the barrelhead. As I signed the receipt, Dale walked by on his way to his shiny new Ford pickup. $600 for a parts tractor, he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. You could have made a down payment on a real machine with that, Art, a real machine. I didn't say a word. I just folded the receipt, tucked it into my shirt pocket, and walked back to my prize. I put my hand on the big, cool fender. It was mine. Every last bolt. Now the real work would begin. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of what it took to bring that old 730 back to life, I need to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like me, who stuck to his guns with old iron while everyone else was chasing shiny new paint? Or maybe you knew a Dale, who bet the farm on the latest and greatest, convinced that bigger was always better? Let me know down in the comments which man you think had the right idea back then, in the late 60s, before everything changed. I had my neighbor Tom haul the 730 back to my place with his flatbed. We chained it down tight, and he grumbled the whole way. Art, I swear, you collect more junk than the scrapyard. It ain't junk, Tom, I said, riding shotgun in his old Chevy C60. It's potential. He just shook his head and spit a stream of tobacco juice out the window. We unloaded it next to my machine shed, a long, low building my grandfather had put up in the 30s. It wasn't fancy, but it was dry and had a solid concrete floor. I pushed the old tractor inside, the big rear wheels surprisingly easy to turn by hand. The place smelled of grease, steel, and damp earth, a scent more comforting to me than any perfume. For the next 2 weeks, that machine shed was my world. I didn't just want to get the 730 running. I wanted to know it, inside and out. I started with the pony motor. It was a little 2-cylinder V4 engine that John Deere used to start their big diesels. A finicky beast if you didn't treat it right. I pulled the plugs. They were fouled with black carbon. I took off the little Zenith carburetor and broke it down on my workbench, soaking every jet and passage in a can of carb cleaner until the brass gleamed. I scraped the old gasket material off the manifold with a razor blade, my knuckles getting nicked and stained with grease. With the carburetor rebuilt, I turned to the ignition. I filed the points, set the gap with a feeler gauge to 15/1000ths of an inch, and checked for spark. A fat, blue crackle jumped across the plug gap. Good. I drained the old sludgy oil and refilled it with fresh SAE 30. I cleaned out the sediment bowl, a nasty collection of rust and water, and what looked like molasses at the bottom. The moment of truth. I filled the pony motor's little fuel tank, pulled the choke, and hit the starter button. It cranked, sputtered, coughed a puff of black smoke, and then caught. It settled into a frantic, high-pitched buzz, a sound that hadn't been heard in that shed for years. A small victory, but it was the first one. Now for the main event. With the pony motor running, I engaged the clutch that would spin the big diesel's flywheel. The whole tractor shook as the little engine strained against the immense compression of the two big cylinders. The sound was a rhythmic whirring and chugging, building speed. I opened the compression release levers, then snapped them shut. I pulled the throttle lever back. There was a deep, resonant cough. Chug. Then another. Chug. And then, with a great belch of grey smoke from the exhaust stack that filled the shed, the big diesel roared to life. It wasn't a smooth, continuous hum like Dale Bishop's 40,020. It was a deep, syncopated rhythm, a powerful and deliberate beat that you felt in your chest. Pop, 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 pop. The two massive pistons, each the size of a paint can, firing one after the other. I let it run for 10 minutes, watching the oil pressure gauge, listening for any knocks or misses. The sound was steady. The rhythm was right. The engine was the heart, but the rest of the machine needed just as much attention. I spent a day just cleaning. I scraped away years of caked-on grease and dirt from the transmission housing and the final drives. Underneath all that grime, the cast iron was solid. I drained the transmission fluid. It was milky with water. I refilled it with 80-90 weight gear oil, a thick, honey-colored fluid with a pungent sulphurous smell. I pulled the head off the main engine. It was a heavy, awkward piece of iron that took a chain hoist to lift. The cylinder walls still had the cross-hatching from the factory. No scoring, no lip at the top of the piston travel. The valves needed work, though. I spent 2 days with a can of lapping compound and a suction cup tool, grinding each valve into its seat by hand, back and forth, until I had a perfect clean grey ring on both the valve and the seat. It was tedious, mind-numbing work, but it was the difference between an engine that ran and an engine that ran right. By the time I was done, I knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every quirk of that machine, and I had less than $120 in parts into it. Gaskets, spark plugs, filters, and fluids. When I first drove it out of the shed into the April sunlight, Tom was there, leaning against the fence. The 730 was still ugly, still faded and patched, but it ran like a Swiss watch. The two-cylinder beat echoed off the barn. "I'll be damned, Art," he said, pulling a piece of hay from his teeth. "You actually did it." "Never had a doubt," I said, grinning down from the tractor seat. But the rest of the county wasn't as impressed. When I took the 730 into town to get the new tire put on, I saw Dale at the co-op. He was filling his brand-new pickup with gas. He just shook his head as I rumbled past, the Johnny Popper, making its distinctive sound. The other farmers sitting on the bench outside the feed store nudged each other. I heard one of them say, "Polishing a turd. That's what he's doing." That spring was a wet one. The rain came down in sheets, turning the fields into a thick, black soup. It was getting late to plant corn, and everyone was getting nervous. Dale tried to take his new 4020 and his big 12-foot disc into the field, and the tractor sank up to its axles in the gumbo mud. It took 2 other tractors to pull him out. He lost a whole day. My old Farm All M and the new 730 were lighter. They had narrower tires. They rode on top of the mud instead of digging in. I was able to get my fields worked, and my corn planted a full week before Dale and the other big operators. It was a small thing, a bit of luck with the weather, but it felt good. Harvest that year was a different story. The corn was tall and thick, a good crop. But my old Massey Ferguson 35 combine was showing its age. It was a small machine, powered by a little 4-cylinder Continental engine, and it was slow. I could only harvest 2 rows at a time. Across the valley, I could see Dale's new John Deere 6600, a monster of a machine, chewing through 6 rows at a time, its grain tank extension glowing yellow in the setting sun. He was doing in one day what took me 3. Then, halfway through my last field, it happened. A loud bang, a sickening crunch of metal, and the whole combine shuddered to a stop. I shut it down and climbed out, my heart sinking into my boots. I knew that sound. I crawled underneath. Sure enough, one of the main bolts on the final drive had sheared off, and the gears had jammed, cracking the housing. There was no ordering a part for a machine that old. The dealership would just laugh. So I spent the next 4 hours taking the whole assembly apart under the harsh glare of a single trouble light hooked to my truck battery. I took the broken housing back to my shop. I cleaned it, V-grooved the crack with a grinder, and spent another 3 hours with my old Lincoln arc welder, painstakingly stitching the cast iron back together, peening each bead with a hammer to relieve the stress. It was a messy, ugly repair. But it was strong. I drilled out the broken bolt, retapped the threads, and found a grade 8 bolt in my collection that would fit. By 4 in the morning, covered in grease and sweat, I had it all back together. I fired up the combine. It moved. The repair held. I finished the field as the sun came up, exhausted, but relieved. Dale had been done for a week, his grain already sold. The talk at the diner was that old Art Madsen almost lost half his crop because of that junk pile he called a combine. They didn't see the all-night repair. They didn't see the skill it took. They just saw the old machine and the slow progress. They saw a man falling behind. The next few years settled into that same rhythm. Hard work, long hours, and the constant, quiet judgment of my neighbors. And then, everything went crazy. It started around 72, 73. The Russians bought our grain, all of it. The price of corn doubled, then nearly tripled. Soybeans went through the roof. Suddenly, there was more money in farming than anyone had ever seen. The Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butts, was on the radio telling us to plant fence row to fence row. Get big or get out. Dale Bishop became the local prophet of this new religion. The soaring grain prices and the skyrocketing value of his land made his balance sheet look golden. The bankers, who used to be tight-fisted old men, were now young guys in suits, practically begging farmers to take loans. Money was cheap, inflation was taking off, but nobody cared because land values were rising even faster. It seemed like a can't-lose proposition. Dale bought the 160 acres to the north of him. He traded his 6600 combine for a brand-new 7700 turbo, the biggest, most advanced machine John Deere had ever built. It had a 6-cylinder turbocharged diesel engine, a hydrostatic transmission, and a cab with air conditioning, and a radio. It was a spaceship compared to my old Massey. He tore down his old grain bins and put up a massive new drying and storage system. He was on the cover of the Regional Farm Journal, standing in front of his new equipment, smiling like he'd just won the lottery. He was the king of Calhoun County. And me? I sold my grain at the same high prices. I had more cash in my bank account than my father had seen in his entire lifetime. Everyone expected me to finally wise up. They waited for me to show up at the dealership and trade in my whole line of junk for a new fleet. The John Deere dealer even called me himself. "Art," he said, "we could put you in a new 444, and that 700 for a real attractive interest rate. Time to modernize, son. But I didn't. I saw the frenzy, the gold rush mentality, and it scared me. It didn't feel real. My father always said, the tree doesn't grow to the sky. So I did the one thing nobody could understand. I took that pile of money and I walked into the bank. I didn't ask for a loan. I paid off the last remaining mortgage on the farm, a small note my father had taken out a decade earlier for tiling. When the banker handed me the stamped, paid in full document, it felt heavier than a bar of gold. With the rest of the money, I bought treasury bonds and CDs. The interest rates were climbing higher and higher to fight inflation. I was locking in 7, 8, even 10% interest. The banker looked at me like I had 3 heads. "Art, you could leverage this into another half section of land," he said, practically pleading. "Land is making 20% a year. The bank doesn't lose when interest rates are 10%, I told him, and neither will I. The word got around fast. Art Madsen had cashed out. He'd quit. He was sitting on his money while the getting was good. At the diner, the talk stopped being quiet mockery and turned to pity, even contempt. I was a fool, a coward, a man who didn't have the guts to seize the opportunity of a lifetime. Dale Bishop drove by my place one afternoon, saw me out in the yard greasing my old planter, and just shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. In his eyes, and in the eyes of the whole county, I was no longer just an eccentric. I was a failure, a man left behind by history, tinkering with his relics while the world moved on without him. It was the fall of 1979. I was debt-free on paper, but I felt more alone than ever. The hum of Dale's massive operation was a constant reminder of my choice. It was the sound of progress, the sound of the future. My farm was quiet, the silence broken only by the clank of my own wrenches and the steady, rhythmic pop-pop of my old 2-cylinder engines. Late one night, I was in the shop, rebuilding the water pump on the farm all M. I had the radio on, tuned to a station out of Des Moines. The farm report was over, and the news came on. They were talking about the economy, about runaway inflation, about the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker, who was promising to break inflation's back, no matter what it took. They said he was raising interest rates to levels nobody had ever seen before. I stopped my work, a wrench in my hand, and listened. Outside, the autumn air was still and cold. It felt like the calm before a storm, the kind of deep, unnerving quiet that comes just before the sky tears itself open. I didn't know what was coming. Not exactly. But I had a feeling that the price of shiny new paint was about to get very, very high. The quiet years ended in the summer of 1980. The sky turned a hard, metallic blue and simply stayed that way. The rain stopped. Day after day, the sun beat down, baking the black soil into a cracked grey plate. The corn, which had shot up so promisingly in June, began to suffer. The broad green leaves curled in on themselves, trying to hold what little moisture they had, turning a sickly, pale yellow at the edges. It was the kind of drought that broke your heart, because there was absolutely nothing you could do but watch your year's work wither on the stalk. Then came the second blow. President Carter had embargoed grain sales to the Soviet Union. The market, which had been the foundation of everyone's prosperity, collapsed overnight. The price of corn at the local elevator fell by $1 a bushel, then more. The very thing that had fueled the boom, endless demand and high prices, vanished like a puddle of water on a hot road. I watched it all from my debt-free island. The drought hurt me, same as anyone. My yields would be down by half, maybe more. But I had no bank payment to make on the first of the month. My operating costs were just fuel, seed, and my own sweat. For Dale Bishop, it was a different story. His entire empire was built on the assumption that prices would stay high and yields would be perfect. He had massive payments on his land, his equipment, his new grain setup. Payments that had been manageable when corn was $3 a bushel were now impossible at $2. The first real crack showed in October. We finally got a little rain, just enough to make the shriveled ears of corn damp and tough. It was a miserable harvest. I was out on my old Massey 35, clattering along, the machine groaning but working. Across the valley, Dale's gleaming 7700 Turbo was a silent, yellow statue in the middle of his field. It sat there for a day, then 2. On the third day, I saw the John Deere service truck pull into his lane, its green and yellow paint looking painfully bright against the dying landscape. I saw Tom at the feed store later that week. He was loading sacks of cattle feed, his face grim. "Heard about Dale?" he asked, not looking at me. "Saw the service truck," I said. "Hydrostatic pump went out," Tom said, shaking his head. "Took the kid from the dealership 2 days to diagnose it. Said the part had to be special ordered from Moline. They flew it in. You don't even want to know what the bill was." He paused, then spit. Dale lost 4 good harvesting days, corn starting to mold on the stalk. That was the problem with those new, complicated machines. When they worked, they were miracles of productivity. But when they broke, you were helpless. You couldn't fix a hydrostatic pump with a welder and a good set of wrenches. You needed specialized tools, diagnostic gauges, and a kid with a technical manual who charged $75 an hour just to drive out from town. My Massey broke down twice that harvest. A bearing went out on the main cylinder, and I tore it apart and replaced it with a spare I had on the shelf in under 3 hours. Later, a belt snapped. I had a new one hanging on a nail in the shed. Total cost for my repairs that fall, $17.50. The harvest ended, a grim and dusty affair for everyone. The yields were terrible and the prices were worse. At the diner, the usual boisterous talk was replaced by hushed, worried conversations. Men who had been bragging about their expansion plans a year ago were now staring into their coffee cups, their faces etched with lines of fear. They were all talking about interest rates. The radio was full of news about that man Volcker at the Fed, a grim-faced executioner determined to kill inflation. The prime lending rate, the number the banks based all their loans on, was climbing. 10%, 12, 15. Dale's loans, I knew, were variable rate. He'd bragged about it, how he'd gotten a better deal that way. It meant his interest payments were tied directly to that prime rate. Every time it ticked up a point, the chain around his neck got a little tighter. The first foreclosure notice went up on the courthouse bulletin board in January. It wasn't Dale. It was a young farmer over in the next county who'd gone in deep, just like him. It was a shock to everyone. Farm foreclosures were something you read about in history books, something that happened to your grandfather during the Depression. It wasn't supposed to happen now, but it was just the first stone in an avalanche. The winter of 1981 was long and brutal, but the economic winter was worse. The prime rate hit 20%, then peaked at an unimaginable 21.5%. Land values, which had been the collateral for everyone's dreams, collapsed. A piece of ground that had been worth $3,000 an acre 2 years ago was now struggling to fetch $1,500, if you could even find a buyer. Farmers were trapped. They owed $3,000 an acre on land that was now worth half that. They were upside down, their net worth wiped out in a matter of months. The bank that had once courted Dale Bishop now treated him like a disease. The friendly loan officer was replaced by a stern man from the regional office who spoke only in terms of liquidation and asset recovery. Dale was forced to sell off his new grain bins at a loss. He sold his herd of cattle. It wasn't enough. The interest on his loans was accumulating faster than he could possibly pay it down, a monstrous, unstoppable machine of debt. I saw him one day at the co-op. He looked like a different man. He'd lost weight, and his face was pale and gaunt. His new DeKalb hat was gone, replaced by a filthy, sweat-stained cap. His eyes, which had always been full of arrogant fire, were now dull and haunted. He was buying a single hydraulic hose, and he argued with the man at the parts counter for 5 minutes over the price. He paid for it with a crumpled handful of bills. He saw me standing there, and for a moment I saw a flash of the old anger in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. He just nodded, a slight, defeated gesture, and walked out without a word. My own situation was the mirror opposite. The drought and low prices meant I wasn't making much money from the farm itself, but I wasn't losing any either. And the high interest rates that were destroying my neighbors were a blessing for me. My treasury bonds and CDs, the ones everyone had laughed at, were now paying me 16% interest. I was earning a steady, reliable income from my savings, a stream of cash that kept my farm afloat while the world around me was drowning. I used the money to live on, to buy fuel and seed, and to keep my old iron in perfect repair. I was a ship in a safe harbor, watching the hurricane rage outside. The end for Dale came in the spring of 1983. The auction notice was printed in the county paper, a long, grim list of everything a man spends his life accumulating. 1 John Deere 7700 turbo combine, 1 John Deere 46/40 tractor, a 6-bottom plough, a 24-foot disc, planters, wagons, shop tools, and at the bottom of the list, the words that felt like a death sentence: 160 acres, more or less, in Section 14 of Calhoun Township. It was his home place, the farm his grandfather had homesteaded. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a perfect match for the mood. The crowd was different from that day I bought the 730. There was no joking, no laughter. The farmers stood in small, quiet groups, their hands in their pockets, their faces grim. They looked at Dale's magnificent line of equipment, now tagged with auction numbers, not with envy, but with a kind of morbid fear, as if it were contagious. They were all thinking the same thing: there but for the grace of God go I. Dale was there, standing by the porch of his house with his wife. He looked like a ghost. He wasn't watching the crowd. He was staring out over the fields, his fields, for the last time. The auctioneer started, his voice unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. He sold the small items first, the tools, the wagons. The prices were pitiful. Nobody had any money. Then he got to the big-ticket items, the 4640 tractor, which Dale had paid over $40,000 for, sold for $18,000. The mighty 700 combine, his pride and joy, barely brought $25,000. I could see the banker in his dark suit, scribbling furiously on a notepad, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He was just tallying the numbers, adding up the pieces of a man's broken life. Then came the land. "All right, folks," the auctioneer boomed. "Now for the centerpiece. 160 acres, with farmhouse and buildings. The original Bishop homestead. Who'll start the bidding at $1,000 an acre?" Silence. $1,000 an acre was a fair price, maybe even a bargain, but it might as well have been $1 million. Nobody had the cash or the credit. The banker stepped forward and whispered something to the auctioneer. "Folks, the bank is prepared to offer financing to a qualified buyer," the auctioneer announced. but it didn't help. Nobody wanted to take on new debt, not now. Not after seeing what it had done to Dale. The auctioneer tried again. $1,000 an acre. Do I hear 1,000? 900. Will anyone give me $900 an acre for this fine piece of ground? The silence stretched on. I looked over at Dale. He had his arm around his wife, who was crying silently into his shoulder. His face was completely blank, his eyes empty. He had lost everything, and now he had to suffer the final humiliation of no one even wanting what was left. I took a deep breath. I had walked the boundary of that farm 100 times as a boy. I knew every dip and swell of it. It was good land. I stepped forward. The crowd parted slightly, turning to look at me. $1,000 an acre, I said, my voice clear and steady. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The auctioneer's head snapped in my direction, his eyes wide. I have 1,000 from Art Matson, $1,000 an acre. He looked around, trying to work the crowd. Do I hear 1,100? 1,000 is the bid. Who'll give 11? But there was no one. The banker nodded to the auctioneer. He knew this was the only real bid he was going to get. Sold! The gavel cracked. For $1,000 an acre to Arthur Madsen. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt a deep, quiet sense of gravity. I walked over to the clerk's table, which was set up on the tailgate of a pickup. The banker was there, a thin, tight smile on his face. He was expecting me to ask about the financing terms he'd just offered. I reached into the inside pocket of my coat and pulled out an envelope. From it, I took a cashier's check from my bank. I had been there the day before. It was for the full amount, $160,000. I didn't say a word. I just signed the paperwork and handed him the check. He stared at it, then at me. His professional composure cracked for just a second. He couldn't comprehend it. In the middle of the worst farm crisis in 50 years, a man had just paid cash for a farm. I took my copy of the sale bill and walked over to Dale. He was still standing by the porch, looking lost. He saw me coming and straightened up, a flicker of his old, defiant pride in his eyes. He thought I'd come to gloat. It's good land, Dale, I said quietly. My grandfather always said your grandfather was the best farmer in the county. He just stared at me, his jaw tight. I've got a proposition for you, I continued, looking him straight in the eye. I've got no use for the house. You and your family can stay, rent-free, for as long as you need to get back on your feet. And I'm going to need help working this new ground. I'll pay you a fair wage to run it for me. You know it better than anyone. He was stunned. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. His eyes filled with tears, and the pride, the anger, all of it just washed away, leaving behind a man who had been pushed to the absolute limit and had just been offered a hand. He nodded, unable to speak. We'll start tomorrow, I said, and walked away. The years after the crisis were quiet and lean, but they were good. The community, humbled and broken, began to heal. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a new appreciation for thrift and cooperation. Men started sharing equipment again, helping each other with repairs. They started coming to me. At first, it was just for a specific part from one of the old tractors I had for salvage. Then it was for advice. My shop, once a place of solitary work, became a gathering spot on cold winter days. Men huddled around my wood stove, talking about how to rebuild a carburetor or weld a cracked frame. They no longer saw me as a relic. They saw me as a survivor, a man who had seen the storm coming and had built his house on solid rock. Dale stayed on, working for me. The arrangement was awkward at first, but we found a new kind of respect for each other. He was a good farmer when he wasn't burdened by debt. He knew the land, and I knew the machinery. Together, we made that farm prosper. After a few years, he started renting the ground back from me, and eventually he saved enough to buy back the house and the 10 acres surrounding it. He never tried to expand again. He was content. The farm economy slowly recovered. Land values crept back up. By the mid-90s, things were good again. I had used my savings to buy 2 other farms during the worst of the crisis, picking them up for pennies on the dollar from insurance companies. I was now farming nearly 1,000 acres, all of it paid for. My old John Deere 730 still did the planting every spring, its steady pop-pop, a comforting rhythm that had never failed me. But time marches on. By 1999, I was in my 60s. The machines were getting bigger and more efficient than ever. It was time. I walked into the John Deere dealership, the same one that had tried to sell me a Ford 40 20 years earlier. It was a massive, glittering place now, with more glass than a cathedral. A young salesman in a crisp green polo shirt and khaki pants met me at the door. He looked at my faded overalls and worn work boots with a barely concealed smirk. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescending politeness. "I'd like to talk about combines," I said. "Well, right this way," he said, leading me toward the biggest machine on the floor, a brand new 906050 STS. It was a Leviathan, a technological marvel with GPS steering, yield monitors, and a cab that looked like the cockpit of a 747. This is our top-of-the-line model. Single-tine separation, 300 horsepower, 30-foot draper head. She's the best there is. I walked around it, my eyes taking it all in. I nodded slowly. "It's a fine-looking machine," I said. "I'll take 5 of them." The salesman's smile froze on his face. He blinked. "Excuse me?" he stammered. "Did you say 5? "That's right," I said. 5, and I'll need 5 of those 30-foot heads to go with them." He laughed, a nervous, uncertain sound. "Sir, that's a multi-million-dollar order. We'd have to run a full credit and financing application." I reached into my pocket, the same way I had at Dale's auction all those years ago. I pulled out my checkbook. "That won't be necessary," I said, clicking my pen. "Who do I make it out to?" The young man's jaw dropped. He just stared at the checkbook, then back at my face, his eyes wide with disbelief. The dealership's owner, a man my age who had taken over from his father, came out of his office. He saw me, saw the checkbook, and a slow grin spread across his face. He knew my story. Everyone in the county did. He walked over and clapped the stunned salesman on the shoulder. "Son," he said, his voice full of respect. "Go get Mr. Madsen a cup of coffee. He's good for it. Last spring, I brought my grandson out to the machine shed. He's 10 years old, with a mind full of video games and computers." I pointed to the corner, where the old 730 sat, still wearing its faded paint, still ready to work. "That's the tractor that built all this," I told him, sweeping my hand out toward the fields, green and lush under the morning sun. "It's not the biggest or the fastest, but it's honest, and it's all paid for." I handed him a grease gun. "There's a zerk on the front axle pivot," I said. "Give it 2 pumps, not 3. He looked at the old machine, then at me, and as he wiped his greasy hands on his jeans and got to work, I knew he understood. It was never about the tractors. It was about the difference between what's shiny and what's real, between what you owe and what you own. It was a lesson written in steel and soil, a legacy forged in the quiet rhythm of 2 cylinders, firing steady and sure against the storm.